Alright, so before I really get started on the actual topic at hand here, I want to get one thing out of the way before people in the comments get on their keyboards and tell me to kill myself. Everything I'm going to say in this video is purely subjective, but you never know what people are going to think about a thing, so just keep in mind this is only my opinion. Please be nice. Alright, with that said, in this video, I'm going to try to explore some of the things which I feel make a movie look, well, good. And part of that is going to be exploring some things that I think can make a movie look bad as well. So I watched Point Break a couple weeks ago for the first time in a while. I'd purchased the 4K Steelbook, hadn't seen the movie in a long time. My girlfriend had never watched it, and I said, we're gonna pop this thing in, and we're gonna see what's happening. And I noticed something in it that I hadn't remembered really paying much attention to in past viewings, and that was just how beautifully shot Point Break is. This is a darn good looking movie. I mean, probably not one of the 100 most beautiful films of all time, but I think for what it is and the genre it occupies, this is a surprisingly visually interesting film. But it was this shot in particular which really made me stop and think, wow, this is something. Now, this shot itself is not something which is like particularly mind-blowing or complex or difficult or impressive in the grand scheme of things. But it does have everything that I feel goes into creating a pretty image on film. And basically, this boils down to 5 different traits that I feel are important. And that is basically lighting, color, color balance, framing, and texture. Now, please keep those 5 points in the shot from Point Break in mind, because I'm going to keep using them as a reference throughout this entire video. Before I get too deep into the actual technical stuff, though, I first want to acknowledge that what this video is primarily going to be about is cinematography. A lot of times when we talk about films, we sort of just reduce them to the directors behind the camera, when really, especially if you're looking at the visual aspects of a film, the cinematographer is just as, if not more, important. Alright, so at the beginning of the video, I said that all of this is going to be largely subjective, yes. However, there are aspects of good-looking images which I said are objective. Like, if you're talking about the rule of thirds or leading lines, those are just things that exist. You can't really argue that. I mean, you can argue their merits, but regardless, they're there. They're tricks that pretty much everybody uses or breaks for whatever reason. They're kind of an agreed-upon steadfast rule. We don't quite have the same thing when it comes to, say, color grading, but we have some close examples that are just less well defined. For instance, when you're color grading a film, you should probably color grade it so that, well, the audience can see what is going on. Again, that seems like something basic, but it's been a big issue with some pretty big releases, including something like The Batman or Game of Thrones Season 8. Now, I think The Batman is color graded fine. Like, I can watch the movie and see what's happening, but I also have a pretty good TV setup. However, something like Game of Thrones, I feel just is poorly color graded, or at least poorly lit, because you can't see what's happening. I would hazard a guess that it was well lit on set and they've just darkened it too much, and that is an issue. And that brings me to an example that I want to share from my own experience, a little film that I made in 2019 called Roses of the West. Now, Roses of the West is a Western film that me and my friend shot for a budget of like $10 and like a couple peanut butter jelly sandwiches type of thing. And there are a lot of things that are really wrong with it. The plot and such doesn't really matter. All you need to know for this video is that I made this movie about 5 years ago, and when I put it together, it was 3.5 hours long, which is just way too much. And I did play it in a theater, actually. So I needed to shorten it so that the people who were at the theater wouldn't leave it immediately. And I came to a version that was about 2.5 hours. I didn't really like this version. There were a lot of things about it I wanted to change. And so for the past couple years, actually, I've been reworking the entire movie. Initially, I just started off restructuring and re-editing it, but this turned into me realizing that pretty much everything about it was just wrong. I mean, I felt good about the story, and I felt pretty good about most of the stuff that we had filmed, but it looked awful and it felt awful. So I've spent a lot of time going back and recoloring and regrading the entire movie. This is an example of a shot from the theatrical. This is the original version of the movie. It's very dark and it's very muddy, and not in a good way either. There's a couple problems here, but first, what's right is that when we filmed this, there was enough light on set. Like, it looked good in camera, otherwise we wouldn't have shot it. Me and my buddy David, shout out to David if you're watching this, and I know you are Did a pretty good job with this, especially David. We filmed the whole thing with various Canon DSLRs. The actual cameras don't matter. That filmed at a max of 1080p. And I bring this up because a lot of times when we talk about color and brightness especially, we focus on HDR, that high dynamic range that you typically get with 4K. I did not have that to work with this footage, but that doesn't matter because you can still color grade 1080p footage and balance it properly. Obviously. I did not do that in the clips that you are looking at here. I really darkened the film because all I knew how to work with were color curves. And basically what color curves do is, well, they curve the colors. They boost certain things and they crush other things. I didn't really know how to use it at the time. I just recognized, hey, this makes my colors pop more and it makes the image look better. But really all I ended up doing was darkening the movie. I boosted the colors that were already there and I hid colors that needed to be brought out. In other words, my image was not balanced. And you can see this not only in like shadows and things, but specifically even in scenes which are well lit. Characters' eyes disappear. Their eye sockets become just sort of these black voids, which A, looks ugly, but B, is very bad because the eyes are the window to the soul, and one of the most important parts of a character performance is their eyeballs and the expressions that they're showing on their face and accessory to their eyes. So that was something that I really worked hard on fixing. And again, to fix that, you need to know how to balance your image. And in order for an image to be effective, it either needs to be well balanced or the information which is being lost intentionally, like in the corners or edges of the frame, because it's not important. Again, look back at this example from Point Break. The shot of Johnny Utah and Tyler lying in bed, again, is not the most complex in the world, but I think it's beautifully balanced. You do have some darks and you have some lights that create this great contrast. Again, that dynamic range helps. Part of dynamic range is not just the things on the edge, it's the stuff in the middle, and you can see the middle pieces here really well. In my film, you absolutely could not see those middle pieces. All you could really see were the emphasized darks. Now, this is okay if it's what you're trying to do, like the Batman does this a lot. I was not necessarily trying to do that, so it looks like shit. Another problem with my film here is the texture. That was one of the other 5 points I brought up as important, and I learned it from working on my own movie. A lot of the footage we shot was noisy because we were shooting in low light. And yes, we had enough light, but it resulted in a noise that just really bothered me because it didn't look clean enough. So I downloaded a denoiser and I slapped that over all of my film, and it looks terrible. It makes these people look like weird plastic, gooey, rubbery monsters, and I don't like it. And now that I've been restoring my own film, I've just leaned into that noise, and I've actually added a bit of a film grain to it because that's just what you do in order to give it a little bit of texture so that it feels real. You wouldn't want to do this on every single film, again, don't get me wrong, but on something like a Western, I feel like texture is really important because it makes the film feel organic and it makes it feel real. In a movie like Point Break, I think that texture works really well as well. Now, on the note of color and texture, I want to shift to a real example that everybody's going to be familiar with. And that is, of course, the filmography of the one and only Christopher Nolan. And what I'm going to say next is probably going to make you mad, so sorry about that. But I feel like generally, Christopher Nolan's movies, particularly his most popular ones, tend to be, they're kind of ugly. Now, to be clear, I do not think that they are like train wreck ugly. Mostly I think that they're ugly in the sense that they are just shot functionally, which is okay. He does have exceptions, however. For instance, Oppenheimer is a beautiful film. There's a reason that Hoyt van Hoytema won, the best cinematography award at the Oscars for Oppenheimer. The opening shot of Oppenheimer alone, I think, blows everything else Nolan has ever done out of the water. And a big part of this is, of course, the fact that it was filmed in IMAX, but that's not everything. The Dark Knight has a lot of IMAX sequences, and while they look okay from an action standpoint, I don't think that they're necessarily pretty images. Bigger doesn't just automatically mean better. What I think really works about Oppenheimer, and what I remember most about it, is the fact that big ol' IMAX film, is used to capture small things. For example, this opening shot is of nothing more than droplets of rain falling in a puddle.
Opening with the raindrops on the water came late to myself and Jen Lehman in the edit suite, but ultimately became a motif that runs the whole way through the film, became very important.
And this is an example of framing. Framing is a key aspect of not just storytelling, but of also setting mood and tone. This shot of the droplets in the puddle basically tell us what the film is going to be about. The ripple effects of what Oppenheimer has done. And the movie is full of these small, lingering moments which catch things that don't necessarily contribute to the wider, huge spectacle of the narrative, but instead create the smaller, more intimate spaces of the story. A lot of Nolan's other movies, like The Dark Knight or even Inception, don't have these things. And if we're talking about color, which Oppenheimer uses very well, the Dark Knight movies exist largely in this kind of muddy space of black and blue. Now, again, it makes sense why they would do that. They're about Batman and he lives in the shadows and such. But I think when you even compare The Dark Knight to Batman Begins, there's a clear contrast. Batman Begins is a pretty good-looking movie. It leans a lot more into those warm yellow and kind of reddish-orange tones, and it uses different types of landscape, like you have snow in the film as well, whereas The Dark Knight is largely just gray concrete backgrounds. When we talk about something like Inception, though, I feel like it's a lot more easy to pin down. Inception takes place almost exclusively in these weird urban spaces of grays and blacks, and that's largely it. It's not a very appealing color tone, which doesn't automatically mean it's bad. Again, don't get me wrong. Something like Insomnia is beautiful and looks amazing and relies almost entirely on a gray and white color palette. However, just because you can film with more style doesn't necessarily mean that you should. There are some people out there which don't use any restraint at all. Which brings me to Zack Snyder.
I'm like, wake the fuck up!
Now, I know that Zack Snyder is sort of known for and revered for his visual style and language, and I definitely think that he has an interesting eye. He collaborates with Larry Fong a lot, and when the two are cooking, they're cooking. Watchmen, for all of its other faults that people have about it, I think is a very beautiful looking film. It's well lit, it's amazing, the slow motion works for me every time. It is an overindulgent piece of media, but I think that visually it is a striking movie. It uses texture well, it uses color really well, pretty much every shot in that is perfectly framed, it's all very well balanced, and it just works. This is not the case for a lot of Snyder's movies. Sucker Punch is not an attractive movie. For example, in basically just the opening end of the film, we have these scenes set in the asylum. This is what's actually happening in the narrative, and it's supposed to be very sad and dark and depressing. So the color grading is like gray, a lot of gray tones to the point where it's almost black and white, but not in an attractive way. It's just like very desaturated, whereas other filmmakers will use black and white or gray tones in order to accentuate certain tones. Zack Snyder's not doing this here. Basically, everything is desaturated and crushed. And what you get are a lot of very ugly, dark images that are just extremely flat with almost no contrast. And this would be fine, and I would accept it as part of the narrative, were it not for what to me is a mistake. And that is the fact that a lot of characters' eyes are hidden by that darkness. And this stands out to me because it's a mistake that I made on my own film as a 19-year-old. It's not something that should be happening in a major studio blockbuster like Sucker Punch.
I'm like, wake the fuck up!
Now, maybe this is just because I watched the film on Blu-ray. I don't know. A 4K scan might be kinder to the color grading. I don't know. Now, the film does get better when she's like thinking about them being in this dance club thing instead. However, it's just like functional. It's fine. There's a lot of warmer tones and things and more well balanced. You can see what's happening, but it's nothing special. But things get really, really ugly anytime Baby Doll and the rest of the girls go into the video game dream sequence dance number parts. These just don't look good, and it's due to the artificial fill, the bad lighting, the CG environments, the poor effects, and the unnatural look of everything. And you can go for a good liminal, unnatural lighting and have it work. Zack Snyder has done this before. He does it in Man of Steel, but it doesn't work for me here because it just, well, it doesn't look convincing. But a film of Snyder's that I think does look good is Batman vs. Superman. I know people are going to disagree on this one, but I think that the way he has colored it, especially in terms of how Superman is colored versus Batman is colored, works. The film has a great texture to it. It was shot on film. It looks grainy and like you can touch Ben Affleck. It's just epic. I love the framing in this, especially the way Superman is framed in the rescue sequence and the way Batman is always framed, particularly Bruce Wayne, like in these scenes at the graveyard and when he's walking away from Wayne Manor. They're pretty simple images. I mean, you just got a guy framed in a thing or like foreground, background, but they have a sense of perspective and scale to them, which I think is important in a superhero movie and which a lot of superhero movies tend to neglect. This is something that the original Jurassic Park films do really, really well, especially that first one, in which the new ones don't do as well, where the focus is on everything being huge, so there's no sense of perspective. There's no juxtaposition between the small water droplets in a puddle and the gigantic dinosaur or atomic bomb explosion, which I think is important for making your movie and your frame look and feel good. Snyder also is extremely self-indulgent, especially in Sucker Punch. There is no restraint, and there's so much effort put into making things look cool that almost nothing looks good. This is really an issue in Rebel Moon, at least part 1. I haven't seen part 2 because I thought part 1 was doo-doo.
I'm like, wake the fuck up!
Where everything just looks derivative of other movies and just reminds you of things you'd rather be watching, where the color is all really muted and it just is kind of like a muddy mess with almost no range or distinction or interest. And this whole like over-reliance on the gray color scheme is not exclusive to Zack Snyder or Man of Steel. Marvel has been doing this for over a decade. That airport sequence in Civil War is one that's pointed to constantly as an example of just hideous cinematography. Clearly because, I don't know, it's just easier to work with that neutral gray lighting, I'm guessing. And plus, in a lot of these superhero movies, you just have to put them in a place where they can destroy things and fight, and that tends to be cities. Now, Endgame does have its big fight, like in this odd, up cavern. I don't know, this big valley, this big hole where the compound used to be, and it has the artificial fill lighting, and it looks okay. I think it's more interesting than the gray concrete, but it creates this spatial void where you can't keep track of where anyone or anything is because it just all looks the same the entire time. And this is a whole nother issue in itself, but I feel like that contributes a lot to why so many of the movies we're watching these days look ugly. It's because the spatial awareness and the framing don't exist because we're using completely CG gray environments. On the heels of that, there was this image that was going around that kind of became viral that was comparing a shot of Wolverine from X-Men Origins to a shot from the trailer of Deadpool 3. Now, I think it's hilarious we're at a point where we're using X-Men Origins Wolverine as, like, the backboard, the thing that was doing it right. But there is something to be said about why these two images look different and why one looks better than the other. I do agree that the X-Men Origins shot is just visually more appealing than the Deadpool shot. But I think it's stupid to try to just make the Deadpool shot look like the Wolverine shot. Particularly because the people who are doing so are just basically boosting the saturation, and that's part of it, but it's not the only difference here. And I also think we should be clear that these two images exist in very different settings. The shot from X-Men Origins, I believe, is filmed inside, so you have artificial lighting and a pretty intense contrasting color grade, which relies a lot on blacks. This shot from Deadpool 3, I believe, takes place outside, as far as I know. Point being, the lighting in the Deadpool shot is obviously supposed to be more natural and kind of neutral and even, whereas in X-Men Origins, they're inside, so there's an artificial contrast created. So it's not just a difference of color, it's a difference of light. But another big part of that is the texture. So in the X-Men Origin shot, Wolverine he's chiseled looking, and he's also wet and moist because he's supposed to be sweaty. Now, I don't know if he was actually sweaty or if they sprayed him down with a hose. Probably the hose option, I'm guessing. But that creates a very interesting and specific type of, I don't know, dynamic texture to an image that is not present in this Deadpool one. And if he's supposed to be outside and it's supposed to be maybe snowy, as other shots in the trailer are, he shouldn't be sweating or be wet. It just wouldn't make sense. It would be weird and indulgent to make him look as cool as possible, no matter what the natural circumstances are. Another similar issue that we're seeing is in the restoration of older films for 4K re-releases. I watched a video a couple of weeks ago that compares the theatrical coloring of The Phantom Menace to the 4K remaster. And the main thing that they're doing here, other than just completely changing some of the coloring, is removing the film grain. They're taking out the texture and they're totally throwing off the balance. And to me personally, I think the theatrical version of the movie looks much better. Yes, that 4K is sharper and it's crisper, but that's not everything. You can over-sharpen something to the point where it starts to look fake, and that's what happened here. Not only that, but it makes some of the CG that hasn't aged the best look worse. Whereas when you have that natural grain over everything, it looks more, I don't know, natural. It also just has like an organic feeling that works really well for the desert setting. And The Phantom Menace isn't the only film that's been victim to this. Terminator 2 Judgment Day had all of the film grain scrubbed from it, and it looks awful. They look like weird, waxy, bendy people. but I think this is a symptom of a wider trend of making everything look hyper clean and hyper real. But I'm basically going to boil it all down to what I call the Disney Plus look, or the Disney Plus effect, where you really have an emphasis on cools and blues, and you have this hyper clean, denoised look to everything so that it feels more real than your eyeballs, and therefore creates a layer of separation between you and the media, which I just don't really care for most of the time. It's sort of similar to the soap opera effect, or like what might happen if you have something at a really, really high frame rate. And this type of thing would work really well for like a documentary or like for sports, but it doesn't work for traditional storytelling media. This is why when you go into the store and you look at the TV displays, it looks amazing and crisp and crazy because it's shots of like nature and stuff, but that's not how most of your movies are going to look because they're not supposed to. They are trying to simulate something different, whereas shots of nature for a documentary or sports are attempting to simulate realism as much as possible. Some of the most egregious examples of this are Hocus Pocus 2 and the Percy Jackson TV series. The Percy Jackson show actually looks better than a lot of similar content like any of the MCU Disney Plus shows, but it still has this nasty gloss to it and all this fill light that I just really don't like. And for Hocus Pocus 2, it's especially egregious because there is no texture, the colors are all unbalanced, the framing is just extremely poor and boring, and these are all exacerbated by the fact that it has a predecessor, which has a lot of texture, a lot of personality, amazing lighting, amazing framing, great color, and great balance. The sequel has none of that, and so it feels extremely detached from the original film, which just feels very organic, real, and of its time. Now, in a way, Hocus Pocus 2 also feels of its time. The problem is that time is shitty color grading. Similarly, Netflix has like a Netflix look, but I think that Netflix has been better about creating content which does occasionally stand out in an interesting way. Netflix has its properties obviously filmed in a way that is as cheap and accessible as possible. Netflix also counts on you like watching shit on your phone, so they're not packing shots with detail which can be easily lost. Netflix also has to account for low quality streams and like bit rates and refresh rates and all that technical stuff. So I think that they're trying to accommodate smaller screens and poor display settings, whereas when you watch a theatrical film, that is made with the idea being played at a professional cinema on a professional projector, and so everything is made to look as good as possible. Netflix is generally not worried about that shit. But there are exceptions. The Harder They Fall from a few years ago also looks really good, and focuses on a lot of really traditionally wide shots, and a lot of texture and a lot of grain, and also some really amazing use of color. It's color that is highly saturated, but it feels highly saturated when appropriate, and nothing is getting lost or blown out, unlike in something like Hocus Pocus. And also the coloring here is not just focused on cools and blues, but on a lot of harsh reds and blacks and oranges to simulate that desert, saloon, dingy feeling. There is an amazing article on Filmmaker Magazine. It's an interview with the cinematographer of the film by the name of Mihai Malamier. May have pronounced that wrong, but it's called The Horse Needs to Go to the Right, and the director of photography talks a lot about the cameras that were used and the decisions that are made and how to accommodate all of that, especially for a streaming service. So if you're interested, check that out. I'll try to link it in the description. Another Netflix series that of course looks really great is Stranger Things, particularly if you can watch the physical media release. On streaming, it doesn't look as good because the show leans so much into those mid-range blacks and grays, especially at night. Generally, it tends to be a fairly warmly lit show with a lot of reds and oranges, I think to kind of help simulate that nostalgia feel. But these oranges and reds just typically look better as well. The problem is that when you don't have that high dynamic range, like if you're streaming in 1080p or have a slow internet connection, you're going to end up with a lot of crushed or really rigid blacks, and it doesn't look great. But when you watch the stuff on disc, it looks incredible because they're coloring and balancing these things in a way that feels right. Additionally, Stranger Things has a lot of great texture in order to simulate that 80s feel. There's a specific reason for it, and it looks and feels really good. And Stranger Things brings me to another part of this, which is that TV and movies are starting to look more and more alike. And in the 2010s, this was largely a good thing because TV was elevating itself up to the status of film. And I know some people aren't into that, but I just think it's an interesting thing to consider. Now, however, where streaming is sort of the go-to, I feel, for the mind of the average consumer, we have a lot of movies that have brought themselves down to the level of streaming, where everything now kind of looks like a commercial or a soap opera or like something that Netflix would produce. And to be clear, I don't want this to seem like it's just a matter of film versus digital, because it is absolutely not. Yes, there are some times where I think that film looks better, and as I've expressed, I enjoy the texture of film, but there are exceptions to that. So there are digital films, as I was saying, which look really good. I mean, one of them would be Ty West's X. Now, I'm sure what some of you digital haters are thinking is that the reason these digital films look good is because they're simulating a film look. And yes, in the case of something like X, that is absolutely true, and that works perfectly for that genre. But I would raise you the counterpoint of Blade Runner 2049, which I don't feel is trying to simulate a film look at all. It doesn't really care that much about texture, and instead really focuses on that dynamic range of color. Everything is very well balanced and interesting to look at. It's also just a very well framed film, and it uses that perspective that I talked about. Just think of the "You Look Lonely" scene, for example. The things feel real and like they have weight. But the overall look of the film is extremely crisp and clean, which works perfectly for that futuristic setting. Now, as mentioned earlier, Blade Runner 2049 was shot by Roger Deakins, and he chose to use digital for the film, and he's actually said that he prefers digital to film, simply because it's easier to work with and it gives him more options. There are other things out there that look amazing on digital as well, such as the FX series Shogun. Shogun nails everything that is important about making your product look good. It hits all those 5 points from earlier: framing, texture, color, balance, and lighting. Now, most of Shogun was filmed on location in Japan over like 9 months or something. So all the weather and effects that you're seeing are pretty much natural. There is CG in the show that's generally used to expand landscapes or create shots that you can't naturally get, but it's not noticeable in a way that CG is noticeable in like your average Marvel property. There's a great interview on fxnetworks.com with one of the DPs for the show that I think sums up really well why Shogun looks good and why other things do not. The series does not look like a Hollywood version of feudal Japan. It was important to be as natural and as real as possible. Light and depth are always crucial elements when setting up any scene. For Shogun, we aim to use natural light sources and enhance as needed. From a cinematography perspective, that meant no split toning with warm scenes, no super slow motion to make things more epic, no unmotivated backlight, no glossy hyper blue for moonlight, no affected sources, period. And I think that's really it, especially that unmotivated backlight, slowing things down to look more epic, the lack of affected sources. All of that is what we're seeing like in the Zack Snyder Rebel Moon Sucker Punch type of things, or in a lot of the MCU stuff. Now compare this to something like Furiosa, which just came out a couple weekends ago. Furiosa also looks amazing, but doesn't necessarily look natural. There are a lot of really blown out blues at night, for instance, and a lot of hyped up oversaturated reds and oranges, but it works great for the tone of the film and the violence which is being conveyed. Another trilogy which does this really well is the Planet of the Apes films. Specifically, the two Matt Reeves ones, and also Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes. These filmed fake things on real environments and blended together into something amazing, especially War for the Planet of the Apes. These films have texture, they're perfectly balanced, and they have beautiful color. They look great in a lot of other movies which really, really heavily rely on motion capture or CG just don't. Which brings me back kind of now to Point Break and the fact that it's less a matter necessarily of just CG and more a matter of framing. Again, take the CG in Jurassic Park, the original. It doesn't necessarily hold up as well as the effects that are in some of the new films, but it looks better because of that perspective. Another great example of this is Titanic. One of my favorite shots in the whole film is this one, of Jack and Rose on the front of the ship at sunset. Now, clearly there is CG in this to a degree, but they also have some practical boat stuff going on. Regardless, though, the framing of this feels extremely organic and natural. There's a texture to it. The rigging from the ship creates a beautiful leading line down to the two leads. There's a focus on their face, which is really important. You can see her eyes, despite the muted lighting. Rose having her arms out creates a great lateral motion that fills the space up. The background also feels real and organic. This looks like a sunset you could exist in. Compare it to the end of something like Sucker Punch, and I think it's pretty clear what I'm getting at. But again, you don't need to have these big, sweeping, epic romantic shots in order to have a good-looking image. Once more, look at this example from Point Break. It's just two people doing a similar thing to what we have in Titanic, but in a location that everybody has in their house. A bedroom. Now, back to that idea of using a big image to show a small thing, I like to focus on movies like Licorice Pizza or Jackie Brown. These are movies that really focus on characters' faces and have a lot of long, lingering moments of just characters' faces, just people thinking, not even necessarily doing anything. Titanic and Oppenheimer do this as well. Oppenheimer with stuff like the drops of rain in the puddle, and Titanic with hands.
Well, she had beautiful hands, you see?
James Cameron is obsessed with hands, and he shoots hands just as interestingly as he shoots huge sweeping scenes of disaster. Bad blockbusters that attempt to get big scale don't do this. So, in conclusion, if you want to make your movie look good, or you are wondering what makes your favorite movie look good, I would say it comes down to 5 main things. It comes down to your lighting, it comes down to your color, it comes down to the balancing of that color, it comes down to framing, and it comes down to texture. There are things that I think are right that are going to be things you feel are wrong. And that's sort of the beauty of this and the beauty of cinema. And ultimately what makes filmmaking collaborative. Because everybody has different ideas that come together to create the best thing possible, which no one person could create by themselves. So let me know what you think in the comments. Hope you enjoyed the video. And if you did, that's great. If you didn't, that's great too. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.